But today is going to talk about Israel and look at the solutions of Israel as a one state, two state, or three state solution and what the Hazara is going on over there. So with this, I will pass the microphone on to Alon and let him continue on. And you can, by the way, I'll ask everybody, if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand so we can see that you have a question. Please do not interrupt. I am not going to mute everyone right now. So do the courtesy of not interrupting while he's speaking, but raise your hand, and Alon said he will be happy to answer your questions as they come up. So let me give the microphone to Alon and I will sit down. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. I'm going to try to address both the camera on this side and the people on this side. So I have my back turned to you, forgive me. I will just say, if people have questions, yeah, feel free to bring them up. You can write them into the chat also. I'll stop at different times and try to field questions. And at the end, we'll sort of open it up to discussion too. So I'm going to share a PowerPoint here, hopefully. Share. Okay. Sorry, technical issues. There we go. All right. So, good morning, everyone. I called this talk One State, Two States, Three States, Israel, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. My aim in this talk is not so much to do a historical rundown, but to look a little bit at how this territory, the territory of formerly Palestine, now Israel, the Palestinian territories, however you call it, you're going to be controversial, how this territory has been viewed, how it's been looked at, what are the different solutions that have been offered and proposed and attempted, and to see where we've ended up now, how we've ended up in a complete deadlock and where we might go from there. I have put my email on this PowerPoint, and I'll have it again at the end if Bruce has promised me a lot of questions and abuse and things like that. But if anyone wants more follow-up, more questions or more abuse, etc., feel free to email me at any time. So just getting started, just to situate us in this region. This area is the borders of Israel. And over here, sorry, I realized that they can't see me on the Zoom, so I'm going to try to do this with the mouse. These are the borders of Israel, what's called within the green line, something we're going to talk about. This territory here is the West Bank, which is called the West Bank because it is west to the Jordan River. It used to be, the original mandate to Palestine included areas of what was then Transjordan. When that was divided, this became the West Bank. And this is the Gaza Strip, an entirely different area, which if anyone is interested, I will say, if anyone is interested in the history, the political history of the Gaza Strip specifically, I have given a talk about that about 2 months ago, about the entire politics and history of the last 100 years of Gaza. You can look it up on YouTube, look up my name. There aren't that many talks by me, so you will probably find it. Question already. Incredible question. I promise we'll get to that. Oh, right. Good point. Thank you. When Israel and Egypt made peace, why did they not give Gaza back? That is going to be a core part of our talk. The short answer is Israel tried to give it back and Egypt refused. But that's the short version. Okay, so this is the map, the way it looks now. But I'm going to go back a little bit in history and take us through how did we end up with this. Again, is it a one state, two states, or three states? I'm starting with, very briefly, before 1948. And I just titled this, Two Peoples for What Territory? Because what I want to consider is the fact that even before the British mandate for Palestine began in 1917, 1918, there was recognition that there are two different peoples here. And there was a question of what to do with this territory. So Britain, already in its first attempts to get both the Jews and the Arabs in Palestine on its side in World War I, made contradictory promises. To the Arab side, the Hussein-McMahon agreement was an agreement with the Sharif of Mecca that said once this territory is liberated from the Ottomans, the entire area will go over to Arab custody. That was done in 1915, 1916. The Balfour Declaration, I assume most people know about. In 1917, a similar promise was made to the World Zionist Organization, saying this territory will be given to the Jews. So there was already recognition there's two different peoples here, and those questions, what's going to happen with them? Once the British mandate started to try to administer the territory, they realized this isn't working, to say it goes only to one or only to the other. And in 1936, the Peel Commission was a commission from Britain to Palestine to see what to do with this territory. And for the first time, a map was drawn to divide the territory. The first time in our modern history, there was a proposal that said, these two peoples are not going to live together. So let us divide this territory into a Jewish state and an Arab state, with the Jewish state being blue, the Arab state being in, I guess this is pink, I'm very bad with colors. And this territory in the middle was to be maintained by Britain, obviously allowing them to have control of Jerusalem. This proposal was rejected by the Arab side in Palestine. The Jewish side accepted that the country would be division, but rejected the map. And with the advent of World War II, the proposal was simply dropped. Then, continuing on, in 1947, the United Nations drew up the famous partition plan. The partition plan, again, offered that there cannot be one state in this area. There cannot be one state. You need to divide the territory between Jews and Arabs. And this was done based simply on populations. Where there's a majority of Jews, it will be Jewish. Where there's a majority of Arabs, it will be Arabs. And then Jerusalem, of course, would be neutral, belong, it's unclear what, to the United Nations, to Britain, to some international administration. As is well known, that plan did not work out. Israel, or what would become Israel, accepted the plan. The Arab leadership rejected the plan. War breaks out. And in the armistice lines of 1949, new borders are drawn. And that's really where we start what I call the one-state era. I call it the one-state era because as these borders, which were the borders of Israel between 1949 and 1967, are drawn, no one, no side, is considering dividing this territory. No side. The wars that are fought, the conflicts that are fought, are between Israel and other Arab states. This territory over here, what looks like the West Bank, was taken over by Jordan. And Jordan officially annexed it. And it was part of Jordan. There was no idea of dividing the territory. This territory, what would become known as the Gaza Strip, was taken over by Egypt, was not officially annexed. And the conflict was between Israel as a state and other Arab countries as states. That meant that any conflict that occurred between Israel and different Arab countries. There was no war between Israel and a group. There was no thinking of what was going to happen with the Palestinians. It was simply between Israel, Jordan, and Egypt. All issues were seen through this prism. Refugees, another very controversial topic, but the fact remains that the Arab states did tell Palestinian refugees, you're not going to be absorbed here. We're going to wipe Israel off the map, and you will have one state there that will be a Palestinian state. All different facets. If we look, for example, what happened after 1967, when the borders of Israel, as we know, vastly expanded, we see that the resolutions, the United Nations resolutions after that war, Resolution 242, or after the Yom Kippur War in 1973, Resolution 338, also do not ever mention the idea of partitioning the land. There was no such notion. Resolution 242 calls for peace between Israel and Arab neighbors, in which Israel will withdraw from the territory it took over from Egypt, including Gaza, and give it back to Egypt, as a question was asked. And Israel should withdraw from the West Bank and give it back to Jordan. There was no such idea of partitioning the land. Two more notions I want to suggest that highlight this. The PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, is established in 1964 and then reconstituted really in 1968. Its vision, one state for Palestinians. It will be one state of Palestine in which Jews will be able to live as a minority, et cetera, et cetera. No notion of division. From the Israeli side, the settlement project. The settlement project, which began in full force in 1968 and expanded very much in 1977, 78. Also, the idea was to obliterate the notion of dividing this land, take over as much land as possible because this is one state. So that was the idea at the time. No one was proposing the famous two-state solution. Where does this break down? Where does the world start to consider the idea of two states? The idea that we should partition this land again. So the first thing that occurs is the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, is studied and should be studied as one of the most successful organizations in international history. It was established in 1964. It takes prominence in 1968. Within 10 years, through a combination of large-scale international terrorism, large-scale diplomacy, large-scale media campaigns, it becomes known throughout the world. The entire world is talking about the Palestinian issue, not about the Israeli-Arab conflict, but about the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And they really bring forth the idea that there is a local population here that has to be dealt with, rather than resolving the Israeli-Arab conflict. At the same time, in 1974, once the organization is invited to be a permanent observer member of the United Nations, they adopt what's called the 10-point plan. In Israel, it was called the phase plan, which says, for the first time, the PLO will accept any territory that's liberated. For the first time, there's the notion that it doesn't have to be a one wiping Israel off the map, but that instead, we can accept part of the territory. So this starts to break down the idea that this conflict is going to be resolved between Israel and Arab states, that actually is something internal. A second major thing that happens, the surrounding Arab states, primarily Egypt and Jordan, gradually give up their claims to this territory. So Israel signs a peace treaty with Egypt in 1977, 78, and is finalized in 1982, in which the border is redrawn. Israel withdraws from Sinai. And again, sorry, I'm remembering that on Zoom you can't see where I'm pointing, so I'll do it with the mouse. The border is redrawn to here. And Gaza remains under Israeli occupation. Israel never annexed it. Israeli law does not apply there. There are settlements there under Israeli law, but Israel never annexed it. And all of a sudden, there's a notion that Gaza is not going back to Egypt. So now this is an enclave within Israel for the first time. Then the similar process happens with Jordan, not through a peace treaty, but in 1987, there is a last-ditch attempt between Israel and Jordan to resolve this conflict based on those two states, not on partitioning the land. There is an agreement signed between then Foreign Minister Shimon Peres and King Hussein, signed in London, what's called the London Agreement, in which they agreed to implement Resolution 242. Israel will withdraw from the West Bank, give it back to Jordan, and in turn there will be peace. Jordan agreed. The Israeli cabinet rejected this agreement. And Jordan, at that point, says, okay, so we're renouncing this territory. It took a year. But in July 1988, Jordan officially renounces any claim to the West Bank. Says, we're not taking this back anymore. This belongs to Palestinians. Do whatever you want with it. And at that point, we have a situation in which Israel controls the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and the other Arab states are no longer saying this conflict is between Israel and us. It's now Israel and the Palestinians. Yes. It's about to come in. How does the Oslo Agreement come in? It's about, you're really facilitating the questions of moving me forward. Thank you. I thought you promised me more complex and longer questions, I have to say. But think about it. Think about it. Think about it. You promised. A last thing that contributes to the fracture of the idea of one state, that this will be resolved either as one Israeli state or one Palestinian or Arab state, is once Israel controls alone the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank, the First Intifada. The First Intifada means uprising or shaking off, depends how you translate it, is a massive low-level uprising that occurred in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which is important to note that they were operating together against the Israeli occupation. It was not nearly as deadly as the Second Intifada, which we'll get to. But what it was, this picture down below on the right is a famous picture from then. What it was stone throwings, Molotov cocktails, blocking roads, a lot of insurrections. When I say a lot, I will note I was part of a coding project that looked at all the IDF reports of all the incidents that occurred. Over 5 years, we counted over 18,000 different insurrection and violent incidents. The result being that Israel recognized the Arab states are not taking this territory back. And at the same time, we can't control this territory. This is not viable. And the result takes us into the two-state era. So we had this process developing, and we go into the two-state era. And everyone, I hope will forgive me, I'm butchering a lot of history here. There's the fall of the Soviet Union, the first Gulf War, all kinds of things that occur along the way. These are the highlights as I see it. In the two-state era, we have agreements being signed for the first time between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, which is significant not only because the PLO was a major international actor, is significant because it's the first time that Israel was signing agreements with non-state actors. So again, rather than perceiving this as a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, Israel and Jordan, for the first time, there was recognition that non-states also have a stake here and maybe will become states. The initial agreement, sort of, was a declaration of principles. That's the famous picture between Rabin and Arafat shaking hands in 1993. The Declaration of Principles said very little. It said that the PLO would agree to renounce terrorism and negotiate with Israel, and Israel agreed to recognize the PLO and enter into negotiations with it over the future Palestinian state or the future territories. The main agreements was known as Oslo A and Oslo B, are signed in 1994, called the Cairo Agreement. And the most important one is signed in 1995, Oslo B, the interim agreement on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And for the first time, maps begin to be redrawn, setting up different administrations within the Palestinian territories. What the Oslo A and primarily Oslo B did is start to divide administration between Israel and a Palestinian administration, nominally the PLO. The area was divided into what became known as areas, became known in the agreements, areas A, B, and C. Area A, which in these maps is the much darker area. This, I should say, are scanned from Dennis Ross's book. Dennis Ross was the United States chief negotiator or chief emissary to the negotiations. Area A, the darker areas, which in this case is all of Gaza, part of Jericho, and the center of Palestinian towns, administration and security matters was handed over to the PLO. Israel withdrew its forces, renounces all claims to the administration there to security. Area C are the areas that are marked in not white, but sort of lines throughout and down here, were areas within these territories in which Israel maintained complete control. So Palestinian security forces, Palestinian administration, schools, everything, economy was still under Israeli administration. Area B, the most interesting area, some might say, was an area in which there was going to be mixed control. Administration, civil administration, would be handed over to the Palestinians. So responsibility again for schools, welfare, infrastructure, permits, all these things would be handed over to Palestinians. Security matters would be left under Israel's control. Palestinian police was not allowed to have a presence there. And that is these vast areas over here. Now, as you can imagine, this is a complicated situation. As you can imagine, it's not very tenable long-term. And I should stress, it was not supposed to be. The interim agreement was called that for a reason. it had a 5-year expiration date. It was said this is going to be an agreement for 5 years in order for us to eventually move past it, in order to have a permanent solution. Sorry, it's a bad phrasing. In order to have a permanent agreement between Israel and the Palestinians on what's going to be in this territory. In 1998, as the process continued to be stalled, the Y Accords vastly expanded areas A and B and handed more territory over to the Palestinians. And a large part of what was done between 1995 and 1998 was the establishment of what was called the Palestinian Authority. So the Palestinian Authority was the administrative body that was meant to govern these territories that are gradually being withdrawn from Israel. It is an authority officially of the Israeli government, and Israel is passing over administrative control and security control to this authority, in which there were elections, in which Arafat won in 1996, and there were other elections in 2006, which we'll get to. This was the idea, and you can see that the gradual development was towards having 2 states. That was the idea of these agreements. As I imagine is well known, this plan did not work. In 2000, the agreements completely break down, and we can talk for hours, and books are written about why and how. And I will say everyone tends to have an opinion, so do I. But I'm not going to get into it because let's just say the agreements break down. The agreements break down, and we have the fracturing of the 2 states. Between 2000 and 2006, while everyone's still holding on to the 2-state paradigm, the situation spirals massively out of control. The second Intifada breaks out. We have massive waves of terror attacks occurring within Israel. We have massive Israeli retaliations that are leaving devastation in Palestinian towns. Hamas, a group that was founded in 1988, had rejected the very idea of negotiating with Israel, something we can talk about a lot. Hamas is actually one of my main cases that I study. It's one of the reasons I probably don't talk about it enough in these talks, because I'm afraid I'll just go on forever. Hamas is founded in 1988. In the Second Intifada, the Palestinian Authority, which is run under the Palestine Liberation Organization, allies itself with Hamas in order to carry out massive waves of terrorism. One of the things that I still want to stress, though, during this time period, both sides are still relatively looking at this as 2 states, even though both sides are looking at this as within a 2-state paradigm, whether they acknowledge it or not. Any agreement that is done for any temporary ceasefire between Israel and the PLO includes the West Bank and Gaza as one unit, and Israel as another. Any type of operation that is done, military operation, is either against both or either. One exception, Operation Defensive Shield, which is also important to talk about. During the Second Intifada, after a devastating suicide attack that occurs on the eve of Passover in Netanya, Israel launches a massive military operation in the West Bank and destroys a lot of the terrorism infrastructure there. Does not do the same thing in Gaza. And the next thing that I will note, the disengagement from Gaza. So that's the official title of Israel, which is a plan that Israel drew up in 2003 and implemented in 2005 to withdraw from the Gaza Strip. Israel came to the recognition, much like after the first Intifada, that the maintaining of 8,000 people in settlements among 2 million Palestinians in Gaza is not working. It cannot be viable. And as a result, Israel withdraws all of its forces and all of its settlements from the Gaza Strip. Importantly, because we're still in this paradigm of 2 states, Israel and the West Bank and Gaza Strip, Israel negotiates this with the Palestinian Authority that sits in the West Bank. In other words, even though this was supposed to be a unilateral move, Israel handed over administration of the Gaza Strip to the Palestinian Authority, because the idea was there's Israel and there is the West Bank and Gaza Strip. These are the 2 states we're talking about. even though one is not really a state, but that's one cohesive territory. And that was the perception. And the last thing that leads us towards the fracturing is the Palestinian elections in 2006. In January 2006, there are elections to the Palestine National Council, which is, again, this body within the Palestinian Authority. And much to a lot of people's surprise, Hamas wins a landslide victory. It wins a landslide victory. And the entire international community that's involved in this, and Israel included, has no idea what to do. Hamas has not recognized Israel, does not recognize past agreements with Israel, says you signed these agreements with the PLO, has nothing to do with us, on the one hand. On the other hand, this is the democratic process that Israel and the United States was insisting happened in this territory. So what to do? And Hamas, again, because at this point, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are still viewed as one unit, Hamas takes over the government and sets up the government from Ramallah, from the West Bank, and is administering both territories. And that is one of the last moves of the two-state paradigm, because that lasts about a year. I'm going to pause now. If anyone, I know I've been talking a lot. If people want to raise questions or something like that, otherwise we can wait to the end. I don't know if you want to take a look at Zoom and see people. All right, I'm going to try to do this. Pause for a technical moment. The question was raised here very quietly. Do we really care about those on Zoom? I think it's a fine question. Let's see. Why don't you come and help me out? I could just finish the talk, but I was at.
Alon, I don't see anybody raising their hands.
Thank you. Okay,
okay,
so we're done. Okay, so now we're back. Thank you for getting up, and we're back. Okay. So I say, and the third makes three. In June of 2007, Hamas stages basically an internal coup and violently takes over the Gaza Strip. So even though they were the government in the West Bank and controlled Gaza too, because there was not elections to the Palestinian presidency, but just to the National Council, there was still a different president. Hamas stages an internal coup and takes over the Gaza Strip very violently within about 6 days. The Palestinian Authority, the PLO, the body that Israel has negotiated with and has signed treaties with, and that Israel trusted, and I will add, still trusts with all of its agreements to maintain security in the borders around Gaza, for example, they're all thrown out, and in a lot of cases killed. In response, the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, sitting in Ramallah, disbands the Palestinian government. Disbands the Palestinian government that was run by Hamas and throws Hamas essentially out of the West Bank. And within about a year, the elections that were supposed to be for the Palestinian presidency are also canceled. What we effectively have from this moment is three different bodies. From this moment, we have Israel in the middle. If you remember the map, I'll get back to it soon. We have the Palestinian Authority and the PLO in the West Bank, which is still divided into its areas A, B, and C with Israel. And in Gaza, we have an administration that's completely run by Hamas, a group that merges Palestinian nationalism along with a very extreme interpretation of jihad, views nationalism as a religious ideal, and is committed to Israel's destruction. Israel, in response to this, begins a blockade of Gaza because the idea was Hamas remains committed to violence. We're not going to let any weaponry get into Gaza. So Israel begins a blockade from the sea the land, and the air. Egypt also imposes a blockade on its border crossing from the land. And that begins in 2007. That begins in 2007. As is well known, this blockade does not exactly stop Hamas from getting any weaponry. The picture up here, famous picture, is from less than a year ago of Hamas launching hundreds of missiles at the same moment towards Israel, and Israel's Iron Dome launching defenses. What is important to note is that since 2007, all of the different actors here are effectively, not openly, but effectively treating this as three different entities. Israel has gone to war time and again with Hamas. I just mentioned some of them here. In 2009, 2012, 2014, 2019, 2021. And every time that happens, Israel goes to war with Gaza, not the West Bank, which is different than how the previous intifadas were seen when both of these were the same administration. At the same time, in the West Bank, the PLO, Palestinian Authority, continues its coordination with Israel. And that coordination is massive. It is not just security coordination. It is coordination over tax collection. It's coordination over international visits. It's economic coordination. And the deals continue to occur, especially under the current administration, where we see Benny Gantz, Israel's Minister of Security, going and meeting in Ramallah many times. The West Bank is not pretending at all that this has anything to do with Gaza. It is treating it as its own entity. And at the same time, Hamas, while also claiming to represent all Palestinians and claiming that they represent the Palestinians of the West Bank too, in effect, have very little presence there. In effect, their actions from Gaza do not have a lot to do with the West Bank. Which brings us to today, which brings us to the deadlock. Which brings us to how did we end up in this situation? If we look at the map, we have Israel. I say within the green line, that basically means within the borders that exclude the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Population of close to 9 million. In the West Bank, we really have a mixed population. There's roughly 2.7 million Palestinians and an increasing settler activity, now 400,000, give or take, depending on which reports you believe. You have in the West Bank this agreement from 1995 that divided it into areas A, B, and C that was supposed to last for 5 years because it's not a tenable situation, continues. We're now coming close to 30 years. Continues. And in Gaza, one of the densest areas in the world, an area of roughly, if I'm not mistaken, 360 square kilometers. I think that's about 160 square miles. There are 2 million people living under the Hamas government with an unemployment rate close to 50% and controlled by a government that no one recognizes. No one recognizes the Hamas government, not Israel, not the West Bank. However, Israel is continuously signing ceasefire, not signing, but agreeing on ceasefire agreements with Hamas. Hamas delegates are being consulted by lots of different countries because de facto they do run the area. And that's our current deadlock. The one thing I'll say is sort of not really a policy recommendation, just food for thought. At some point, this either needs to be recognized or needs to change. Either the actors, Israel primarily, as the strongest actor here, should recognize there are 3 different states here. Are we going to negotiate with Hamas? Are we going to negotiate with the West Bank separately? Or are we not? Because right now the situation is Israel says that it will not negotiate with the administration in Ramallah. The last negotiations occurred in 2008 because they claim very legitimately any agreement signed with the West Bank does not pertain to Gaza. So what's the point? And at the same time, Israel will not negotiate with Hamas, and Hamas will not negotiate with Israel because they don't recognize each other. So either there needs to be some formal recognition. Okay, what we have here is three different actors, three different areas. We should negotiate with the West Bank separately or not negotiate. Again, I'm not saying from the left or the right, do whatever you want, but you can negotiate or carry out anything you want with the West Bank separately from Gaza, and with Gaza separately from the West Bank formally. Stop looking at this as one Israel and one unified Palestinian entity, or take steps in order to actually reunite these two territories, which can be done. There are different policy steps that can be done on both sides in order to stop the current deadlock and in order to create, once again, some premise of a two-state vision. With that, I think I'm going to stop and give my voice a rest and open it up to debate, criticisms, questions, etc. And we have one already.